1, let's look at economic growth. So, economic issues in Australia's economy. Here's just a sort of snapshot from what the syllabus is saying is important. So we've got aggregate demand and its components. We've got injections and withdrawals, so IGX STM, the simple multiplier and how to calculate it, measurement of growth through changes in real GDP, sources and effects of growth in Australia, the increase in aggregate supply, and trends in business cycle. Okay, let's start off simple, nice and easy. What is economic growth? It simply refers to the increase in the country's productive capacity over time, which is measured through real GDP. Okay, so productive capacity over time has increased, and that is going to be referred to as economic growth. So we actually in 2020 broke a world record with going 28 consecutive years, so in a row, without a recession. And a lot of the countries actually couldn't get this because of the GFC, where a lot of countries fell into recession, but Australia were able to save themselves through stimulus packages that were introduced at the time to encourage people to go out and spend. The recession is 2 quarters or 6 months of negative economic growth. So that's a definition of a recession. Okay, so make sure you do understand that. So, aggregate demand and components. So, aggregate demand is the total demand, which is the level of expenditure over a period of time. So, how do we measure that? We've got CIG minus exports imports, which we'll go through as well. That's a net. Keynesian economic thought looks at this idea of output and therefore growth is determined by expenditure of consumers, of firms, the government, and exports, which makes up aggregate demand. Okay, so that is how we essentially look at how much we're growing. So low confidence, for example, in an economic crisis or a downturn, like let's think back to COVID, where there was a lot of there was a lack of confidence in the economy. There was a downturn, like people were saving the money, they weren't spending, so spending decreases. Just a second point. Demand contracts, so the demand will fall. There's not many people demanding products anymore. They're just trying to save as much of their money as they possibly can, and therefore governments need to intervene and stimulate demand. So they need to come in between and say, hey, look, we actually need demand to grow. So one thing that they did in COVID, for example, was they introduced stimulus packages. They gave out, like in NSW, for example, they gave out Dine and Discover vouchers of $25, I think it was. So you can go out and find a new place to eat, support a local business, or go and discover a place and spend your money there. Go to the aquarium, whatever it is, right? So that was not during COVID, but after COVID, when they were trying to get people back out and back into spending and etc. like that. So hopefully that's making sense. So yeah, like I mentioned earlier, this is what's involved over here. SIG minus the net of the export import. So we've got consumption, which is the C, spending by households. It can be autonomous, independent of income, induced, dependent on income, whatever. Investment, which is spending by business firms to increase productive capacity, influenced by cost of capital, interest rates, profits, business expectations, tax rates, government policy. It's a huge, there's like so many things that impact how much investment comes into the country. Government, so expenditure by either the local, state, or federal government is known as the government area of aggregate demand. So that's the example of, for example, the Dine and Discover vouchers, which was introduced by the state government, I believe. Net foreign demand, so exports, looking at expenditure by foreigners on domestically produced goods and services, which is exports, minus expenditure on foreign goods and services, which is imports, right? So if we have more exports than imports, it means we are actually making more money as an economy than we are sort of giving away or like buying things. So that is where we can sort of determine that. Next, we have aggregate supply. So this is the total productive capacity, which is income when all factors of production are fully utilized over a period of time, which is known through CST, which we'll also go through. So equilibrium is when the aggregate demand is equal to the aggregate supply. Okay, so the quantity of real GDP demanded equals the quantity supplied. Okay, so that's why we have this infamous sort of formula that we use in economics, which is your injections equals your leakages. Okay, so let's think back to this, maybe revision for some of you. This question. So we've got the table shows hypothetical data for an economy where you've got IGX and STM. Which statement about this economy is correct? So you want to determine, okay, which ones are which ones are injections and which ones are leakages, and then determine from there. So at this point, if I were you, I would just pause the video, have a go at this question, have a option. This should be, sorry, this is incorrect. It should just be A, B, C, D. Choose one of the options, and then we'll go through the answer. So pause. Okay. So hopefully you've had a chance to attempt the question. We will now get into the answer. So, let's go through the options here. So, we've got the hypothetical economy. First thing I did whenever I had a question like this, I would separate the leakages and the injections. Okay, so leakage, 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 and then another color. Let's take blue, injection. Okay, so we've got STM equals IGX, which we already know. Let me change the color. Actually, might be a bit confusing. Okay. Right, so we've got STM equals IGX. 35 plus 30 plus 60 equals 125 in leakages, which we identified here. 35, 30, 60. And then injections, we've got 25, 20, and 70, which makes up 115 of injections. So what's the rule? If you're apologies. So if leakages outweigh injections, that means we've got a contracting economy because we've got more money that's leaking out of the economy. It's like a leaking tap of money. Then we've got more money injected into the economy. Injections, however, if injections are more than leakages, that means obviously the opposite. It means that we have more money coming into the economy, so that's an expanding economy. And so if that was the case, which it is here, because we've got which is not here, sorry. So it is contracting because we've got 125 of leakages, which outweighs the 115 in injections. All right, so that's why it's got, again, more leakages than it has injections, so it's a contracting economy. So it is contracting because leakages are greater than injections, and that would be the answer. So hopefully that's making sense. So that's from the 2017 HSC paper. So you can see that these types of questions, these are the types of questions that you will be asked in the paper. Righto, so hopefully that's all making sense so far. We're going to move on to the next point, which is the multiplier. You may have already gone through this, so this might be revision for some of you, or this may be a new concept for some of you. So greater than the proportional increase in national income due to the increase in aggregate demand. So basically we've got a respending respending increases income, production, employment, and economic confidence. So this idea that we've got the increase in AD and that impacts everything else. It's sort of like a flow-on effect. So how do we calculate this? Well, K just means the multiplier. So the multiplier equals 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Or if you don't have the marginal propensity to consume, you can use the marginal propensity to save, and that's going to be 1 divided by MPS. But even if you didn't have it, you could still figure out what the MPC is just with 1, which I'll show you in a second. So if you want to figure out the new income, which is often what you're asked in HSC questions, you then want to get your multiplier, which you've calculated by either one of these, and you want to times it by the increase in income to get your new income. Okay? So MPC is your marginal propensity to consume, or the proportion of your extra money, so every extra dollar consumed. Okay, so amount of consumption divided by change in income is how you get your MPC. MPS is the marginal propensity to save, so the actual proportion of the extra dollar that is saved. Okay, so amount of savings divided by the change in income. So one is related to spending, one is related to saving. So measurement of growth through changes in real GDP. So Australia's GDP sits at around 1.8 trillion, which is, I guess, like sort of an approximate of the GDP. The real GDP is the increase in value of goods and services compared to the previous year adjusted for inflation. So because of inflation, we want to try and remove the effects of that because it can really distort the figures. So we remove that and we get the real GDP compared to just the GDP, which is why it's called real GDP. So the real GDP per capita means per head, so per person. So how do we do that? We just get the real GDP and we divide it by how much ever a population is. So per capita recession is when the population increases faster than real output. Okay. So sources of economic growth in Australia. So anything that encourages growth in aggregate demand. So again, going back to our aggregate demand formula, which we discussed earlier, will be a source of growth. Okay, so Australia has avoided a recession for 27 plus years. Remember back to the world record we broke in 2020? Natural endowment in minerals and energy. So we do have a lot of minerals and energy that we're able to either dig up from the ground as minerals, or we just have a lot of those resources available which we can sell off and make a lot of money out of. Comparative advantage in mining and farming. So we have that comparative advantage. We're able to do it better than most economies in the world, and so most economies will just buy it from us. And highly skilled workforce. So we have a lot of people that are very highly skilled. They go into tertiary education, or they have some sort of education or unique skill set that they can utilize in a job, as well as we have sort of quite good technology as well. So we have a whole range of different factors that help our economy do well, and these are some of the factors that have helped us avoid a recession as a country. So factors of production as sources of growth. Sorry. So natural resources such as land, labor, capital, and enterprise, which is also known as entrepreneurial ability. So increase in the quality of land, quantity or land, or new resources discovered will fall in cost because we have now an increase in supply. However, this needs to be developed within the parameters of the environment. So, a lot of criticism that Australia gets is surrounding this idea that yes, we have a lot of resources in the land, but we are digging up things and we're causing a lot of issues and we're making like fossil fuels, things like that increase, which is not great. So, a lot of people are actually calling on Australia to have more renewable sources of like energy, things like that we can offer. Labour, so the size of the labour force participation rate increases, or increase in the quantity or quality of the labour force are both things that, so it's either quantity or quality of the labour force increasing. So lower costs increase productivity and skills, right? So those are things that we can get out of the labour component. Capital, so increase in capital stock, quality and technology, or capital deepening. So when tech usage grows faster than the labour force, that's something to keep in mind as well. So improvement of production methods can increase, obviously, productivity. So, enterprise is also known as entrepreneurial ability. So, this refers to people with ideas who are willing to take calculated risks and spend money to start and develop a business. This is an investment because if the business does well, it's going to produce money for the Australian economy. Government policies as a source of economic growth for Australia. So, effective government policies and political stability can create a favourable climate for economic growth because investors will feel confident in the economy. They were like, you know what, Australia's doing well, they have great policies, they're really stable politically, so I feel safe investing my money into Australia, and I feel like I will get a return. So the Australian government can use fiscal or monetary policy to influence economic growth. The government's overall role in the economy is to provide a favourable environment for economic growth. Right? That is their role. They want to see the economy grow. So, what are some of the effects of economic growth in Australia? So, we have both positive effects and we have negative effects that we should consider. So, increased living standards due to higher disposable incomes is something that is a positive effect. So, of course, when living standards are improved because people have more money to spend on things, that's a good thing. Increased employment opportunities, which may increase wage growth and support a decrease in unemployment. So, that's another one that is quite important. So, you want to make sure that you do take that into consideration. Um, and then finally, labor mobility. So labor moving across. Structural unemployment, so displaced by tech, which requires new skills. So this may cause an increased spending burden on the government, which is something that needs to be considered as well. Inflation, so increased aggregate demand pulls up prices and possibly leads to bubble growth. The balance of payment issues, if you've been through the balance of payments topic, that is something to consider. So more imports may cause trade deficit, which is not something that is necessarily good for the economy. Thinking back to aggregate demand and net exports. Externalities, so social costs like environmental degradation. So if you've been through the environmental sustainability topic, this may be something you already are aware of. But this idea that we need to consider more than just the environment, more than just the economy and economic growth, because we also have the environment which is impacted, like we talked about with land, right? So if we're just focused on economic growth, we're actually producing things at a mass rate, it's causing pollution, all of these things, that's going to have negative impacts on the environment, which is not something that is good for the economy and the overall country, I guess. So, increased aggregate supply, so improvements in efficiency and technology. So, aggregate supply can increase through increased productivity, which is dependent on the sources of economic growth as contributors to increase overall capacity and efficiency. Right, so capacity constraint is this idea that the economy is constrained as it approaches full employment due to the principle of resource scarcity. Right, so we don't have, and if you think back to the first thing you learned in year 11, is the economic problem. We have unlimited resources, we have unlimited wants, but we have limited resources. So there's a scarce amount of resources, but we have, an unlimited amount of wants. So we need to choose which wants to satisfy with our limited resources. So approaching full employment in the short term means that labor is scarce. Okay? So, therefore, the capacity to grow decreases and the price of labor rises as firms compete for skilled employees and are forced to raise wages which seem more attractive to employees. Right? So, an analogy, why were or are Yeezy sneakers so expensive? It's because sneakerheads compete for a limited amount of shoes, driving prices up. So, there's only a few pairs of shoes in the market. The same logic follows if labour becomes scarce and firms need to compete for that labour. Okay? So, Australia's last recession was actually in the early 1990s, and ever since then, there has been an average of 3.5% of GDP growth in the last 20 years due to the global resource boom and also the terms of trade. So, before the COVID recession, I guess, is the one that we had in the early 1990s. Successful in maintaining a sustainable rate of economic growth that does not push inflation above its target range of 2 to 3% is what we aim for. This is something you may already be aware of, but yes, this is true. Inflation targeting is one of the key factors in Australia's economy. So it's something to take into consideration when we are learning about the economy. Australia experienced below average growth of 1.3% in 08 and 09 due to the GFC. Okay, so due to the GFC, we actually had below average growth. The Australian Treasury stated that Australia avoided a recession after the GFC as the government responded with a large fiscal stimulus, which increased spending. Okay, so that's again something that we've talked about earlier. This idea sort of followed suit again during COVID, the pandemic, when they were trying to recover from the pandemic and they were encouraging people to go out and spend. Australia has higher than average economic growth compared to OECD countries. So there's 3.7% per annum, according to Austrade 2023. So yeah, we are doing quite well with, like compared to other economies of our caliber. So that's pretty good to hear. But there are still many things that Australia can improve.